So I want to delve a little bit deeper into Sam Harris's ideas, and um, really the challenge. I read a good chunk of Harris's full book on the moral landscape, and just to be, upfront, to kind of show my hand here, I really found it unconvincing. Right? I didn't feel like there was, he's claiming that there's a scientific basis for objective morality, and then much like we saw in Kahane, there's just so many assumptions that you never answer, like assumptions that you never really even ask the questions, and so many inconsistencies. It really isn't a grounding. And at the end of the day, I would actually argue that as much as he doesn't want it to be, Sam Harris's morality is actually based in his religion of sorts, which I'll get into. But to start with, he says that religion is a suitcase term, right? Um, okay, I guess I think this begins. You already see from the outset that he doesn't understand or grasp what religion is. Um, he says religion, like sports, is a suitcase term, right? What does he mean? Well, you have this question of what actually fits in it, which goes to my mention of his religion. Is Nazism a religion? Christianity is a religion. Islam claims to be the religion. Hinduism says you're a Westerner who is imposing, certain Hindus will say, you shouldn't call us Hindus. That's an imposed name of something you're calling a religion that we don't even really recognize. We're simply talking about Sanatana Dharma, which is the way the world is. Just recognize that this is the way the world is. It includes castes, it includes spirits, it includes demons, it includes gods, and ultimately, everything is illusion, and there's only one reality, and it's monistic, and everything else has to lose its individualized identity to realize that one is right. And that's not a religion, that's the way the world is. Is Confucianism a religion? It's a philosophy of a sort of conventional, traditional approach to culture, but it challenges certain aspects of the culture. Um, is Buddhism a religion? Right? That's a big question. We can talk about that. Well, what's a sport, right? What's a sport? Is ice dancing a sport? Football's a sport. Is chess a sport? We have competitions. Think about the Olympics. Like what sports, I saw badminton. And you can joke about badminton, but like at some point look up Olympic badminton and injuries. Um, it ain't playing, right? So, sorry, that was an accident. So the question is, religion is a suitcase term, sports is a suitcase term. He's kind of failing to recognize that, okay, maybe on some level, well, the reality is words carry baggage. Okay, but it's not just the word religion. American carries baggage. Patriot carries baggage. Woman carries baggage. Man carries baggage. White, black. Like there's so many words that can, like, what do you mean by that? Words, we communicate through things that are interconnected with meaning through interconnections with various things, right? And based on context, right? If you don't know context, oftentimes you don't even know what's being said. Because why? Because all kinds of things, all kinds of terms carry baggage. Um, I would say there's other things that show that he really doesn't understand or think seriously about religion, right? He says Jainism is a religion of peace. That's as far as he's concerned, Islam claims to be the religion of peace. You want the real religion of peace, it's Jainism, which is really a myopic look at any kind of history of Eastern religions. Um, sorry, right? It's just we tend to idealize one and not look at their full history, and demonize one and not look at their full history, and not look at the humanity involved in each religion. But that said, even if you wanted to take um, Harris at his word, right? Jainism is the religion of peace. Let's say that there's never been a political movement connected to Jainism that abused political enemies. I don't know if there is or isn't, but let's just assume there isn't. Let's assume that Harris is right on that. He says Jainism is the true religion of peace because the more extremist you are, the more peaceful you become. Well, is that really the case? Because the essence of Jainism is the denial of physical reality. So Salakana, right? Well, Harris said, the crazier you get as a Jain, the less we have to worry about you. That's precisely right, because Salakana is the word for what the most radical, extremist, to use Harris's word, craziest Jain would do, which is starve themselves to death. They put a mesh mask over their mouth and nose so that they're careful not to even inhale a bug, and they won't eat anything because they won't destroy any other life, because physical reality is not real, which is, I would argue, self-contradictory. If it's not real, why should you care if you destroy it or not? But they're self-destructive. They actually, um, enact suicide by self-starvation. That's the most extreme Jain. Is that a religion of peace? I don't know. How does that play out ethically? Should they? I mean, you think they're going to bother to feed the poor if they're not going to feed themselves? Um, I'm not trying to pick on Jain or the Jain religion. I'm just pointing out that Harris, when he enters into his invectives against religion and religious people, he really is unfair, and he really is quite frequently ignorant of anything to do with the religions that he criticizes. Um, he hates religion. That's just, he may would even state that, right? So understand, when you're addressing religion in relation to Sam Harris, he hates it. Um, he started all of his talk, right? Mullah Omar, Osama bin Laden, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He says these three men agree in their core concerns more than any three people in this room. I already delved into that a little bit in the previous discussion, right? No, they probably don't. And they might would kill each other if given the opportunity. Um, there were people in the room with Sam Harris who didn't agree with him on many of his views, who nonetheless agreed with him on the basic concept that they didn't have the right to just kill him because they hated him. Um, that's a core concept, right? That's a core Western concern. It's actually rated it's rooted in the sort of Judeo-Christian understanding of humans created in the image of God having inalienable rights, right? That's inherited. Everybody in that room listening to Sam Harris pretty much inherited that view of other human beings. Um, and for that reason, they would not kill each other. Whereas Mullah Omar, Osama bin Laden, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed might, because what did Nasser, who is not, Nasser is not an extremist, he's not a radical, he's not violent. In fact, his life is threatened by radicals. He can't go back to his country of origin because he would be killed by religious fatwa. That Sayyid Hussein Nasser, what did he say? You don't have human rights simply by being human. You get human rights by fulfilling your obligations, right? The self-evident truth of humans having inalienable rights on the basis of their creation is not a Muslim view. It's not a Hindu view. Um, it's a Western democratic view rooted in a Judeo-Christian understanding of what humans are. And on that point, for all of his complaining about it, Sam Harris would be in agreement. Um, with many people who disagree with him on a lot of other things. So when we want to talk about core ideas and fundamentals, right? Sam Harris said the fundamentals of Islam. What are the fundamentals of Islam? I don't know. Which Muslim do you want to talk to? Um, to some degree, there are five pillars of Islam that every Muslim practices. They have to do with the practice. You say the statement that there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is the one, like the true final prophet of God. You say that in Arabic before Muslim witnesses, and you become a Muslim. You're then obligated to pray 5 times a day, to give to the poor, to fast during the month of Ramadan, um, to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Right? These things are those are the fundamentals of Islam, but not according to ISIS, but according to uh, King Hussein of Jordan. They are, and also according to King Hussein of Jordan, one of the fundamentals of Islam is that every surah, every verse in the, or every sorry, every chapter in the Quran starts, except for one, starts with the passage, in the name of Allah, the Merciful and Compassionate, and therefore one of the overarching commands of Islam is to love your neighbor as yourself. Um, ISIS doesn't believe that. Uh, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed doesn't believe that, right? So, what are the fundamentals of Islam that Harris is talking about? And I'm not a Muslim, right? I don't agree with Islam. I don't believe in Islam. Um, but you can't even critique something fairly if you don't confess or if you don't admit to what its self-understanding is and what are the fundamentals of it, right? Um, I oftentimes, when discussing with atheists, like with, and relating to Harris, right? Let's talk about the fundamentals of atheism, right? What are the fundamentals of atheism? Well, you can believe whatever you want because most atheism is rooted in, Western democratic societies because most other societies would put atheists to death. Western democratic society, which owes its existence and its values to a Judeo-Christian ethic of humans made in the image of God, allows for the fundamentals of atheism, which is you should keep God out of the public sphere. But how does that play out historically? How has that played out? When societies embrace the fundamentals of Islam, what does it look like? Chesterton, Solzhenitsyn, who you read, is a big fan of, 19th, 20th century writer, Chesterton, Catholic, said, the truth is that it is only by believing in God that we can ever criticize the government. Once you abolish the God, the government becomes the God. What's he getting at? Well, he's getting at stuff that he was already starting to see in the early 20th century, right? Here are three men who might agree in their fundamentals more than anyone else listening to this lecture, right? Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot. What did they agree on? Well, they agreed on the fundamentals of Islam. That your religion, if it should be allowed to exist at all, should be kept in the private sphere. It had nothing to do with the public sphere. So Stalin killed somewhere between 20 and 40 million people. Mao is responsible for somewhere between 40 and 80 million people's deaths through outright executions, exterminations, battles, and starvation. Same for Stalin. Pol Pot, somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million. They've all launched wars on all kinds of Christian and Muslim and Buddhist practitioners of faith. China to this day does not have real religious freedom, um, right? They all hold to the fundamentals of atheism. Is that what atheism is? Is that a fair estimation of atheists? Um, let's add to it Castro, similarly, right? Persecution and slaughter of many religious people, right? And many non-religious people. They're enemies. Why? If there's no God, then what's the ultimate truth? The ultimate truth is what the government says. There's no basis for denying the government, um, and so the government must be followed exactly. Um, so that's the reality. Um, North Korea, Kim Jong Il's dynasty, right? Similar. The French Revolution, 1797. Revolutionary Mexico, 1917 and following. These big revolutions, they were frequently anti-religious, anti-Christian, and very brutal. Um, why? Because there's no God to govern. There's no God to answer to, and religion doesn't belong in the public sphere. That's the core to their existence, right? So these atheistic governments slaughtered millions and millions of people. Is that the core understanding of atheism? That it shouldn't be in the public sphere? So is that what we should suspect all atheists of? Should we suspect Harris of the same thing? Maybe, maybe not, right? Alfred Kinsey, sex research, sexual exploitation of children, and fraudulent research. Why? Well, there's no God. Why should it matter? Napoleon Bonaparte, millions of people dead because of his ambition. He rejected any religious belief, right? Don Shui, Myanmar, Burma, forced labor, child soldiers, extreme poverty. Jeffrey Dahmer, we've mentioned him before. If a person doesn't think that there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges, right? Is that is that the core principle of atheism? Um, Mussolini seems to have thought so, right? He's this brutal dictator, self-proclaimed atheist. Um, I don't say that to say that atheists can't have a conversation, or we shouldn't, or we should distrust them, we should get rid of them, whatever. That's not my point. My point is, before we take seriously an atheist who criticizes all religious people as holding to the same core values and ridicules them and treats religions in a hated way, often ignorant of their core beliefs and claiming, that they should have nothing to say, right, in the moral and political questions. We might want to question what does the core understanding and the core principle of atheism, that God should be kept out of the public sphere. What does that produce? What has it produced historically? Um, it would be unfair to assume that Jeffrey Dahmer was the quintessential atheist, and therefore dismiss the conversations and the contributions of atheists to moral and political discourse. That's not what I'm saying. I don't think you should dismiss other people because they're atheists. What I am saying is, they don't get a pass, right? Atheism is not the unbiased position. It's a biased position. It's biased to the idea that you shouldn't have religion in the public sphere. And we see countless regimes that have held to that bias and slaughtered millions of people. And if we want to deny that, right, then we're denying truth. Um, we should also note that the moral argument for God, this is where a lot of students get concerned. Like if you say, well, you're making a moral argument for God, so what you're saying is that people who don't believe in God can't be moral. That's not what the moral argument for God is saying. It's not saying that a person who doesn't necessarily believe in God or doesn't believe in God in a certain way can't act morally. When someone says that there's a moral argument for God, they're saying um, for morality itself to be real, there needs to be something transcendent upon which it is based. But a person can still act morally even if they don't believe in that transcendent thing. You don't mean that atheists are capable of moral actions. What we're saying is the grounding for their moral actions is the reality of God, because the reality of morality is based in the morality of the transcendent. Um, that's what the moral argument is saying. So it's not saying that an immoral Catholic priest is better than a moral atheist person. That's not what it's saying either, right? What it's saying is that if you want to understand the basis for claiming anything universally and objectively moral, you're going to have serious problems finding any grounding or root for it in anything other than some transcendent reality beyond physical survival and basic material human interaction. There's no contract that can hold the weight of objective moral reality. There must be something transcendent. This is what Socrates gets at. This is what every one of the religions is saying. Um, and in fact, religious people would say, look, the fact that an atheist values morality, the fact that an atheist feels the need, this is something that Lewis, when you get into Lewis's argument, is the fact that even a person who's not particularly religious has a moral sentiment that sort of drives their actions, shows that there's some transcendent reality as the basis of that morality. Even if they don't admit to the transcendence, their actions admit to it because they hold to principles that on sheer biological, atheistic, materialistic grounds may not make sense. There's something that drives them to moral actions, and it's not explainable by mere contracts, because there's no explanation as to why you should keep the contract. It's not explainable by um, evolutionary principles. It's not explainable by anything that's merely physical. Um, so, one other point that I like to bring up is that, quite honestly, when you start looking at Harris's moral landscape, in spite of the fact that he would, in some ways, say, no, this is not true, His moral landscape is largely rooted in his, we'll call it, to be gracious, we'll call it the philosophy of Buddhism. Because there is a debate: is Buddhism a philosophy? Is it a religion? There are clearly religious expressions of Buddhism. There are expressions of Buddhism that seem more philosophical. But one of the core principles of Buddhism that Sam Harris holds to is the idea of kill the Buddha. What does that mean? Not literally, but there's a Zen Buddhist idea that a Zen student comes to his Zen master and says, Master, what should I do if I meet the Buddha on the way? And the master says, kill the Buddha. What does he mean? He doesn't literally mean go slaughter a man, commit murder. Murder is wrong for all Buddhists. And the student would understand that's not what he means. What the Zen master means is, just like the Buddha said he didn't want to hear of people worshiping him, you shouldn't worship the Buddha. The Buddha is of value only as an example, and according to that Zen master, you are obligated to bring yourself to the place of being the Buddha. And if you're too busy worshiping the Buddha, you can't achieve enlightenment. You've lost sight. So that's the point of kill the Buddha. That is an article that Sam Harris actually wrote on Buddhism and religion, is rooted in that concept of Buddhism. At the same time, much of Buddhism sees God as superfluous, right? There's a story of how a student came to the Buddha and said, how was the universe created? I don't understand. I can't come to practice your religion, your philosophy, your practice if I can't know how the universe was created and who made it. And the Buddha said, well, that's a very interesting question, but it doesn't matter. What I'm concerned about is, well, what was he concerned about? Suffering and how to bring suffering to an end. Oh, wait. What is Sam Harris's basis for his moral landscape? Suffering and its cessation. Harris is very Buddhist in his practice and in his moral theory. Now, I don't know if he's an excellent Buddhist in his practice. I'll get to that in a minute. But in his theory, at least, it's based in what? Suffering and the cessation of suffering. One of his criticisms, if you remember the chart, he has this, we'll come to this later, but this image of all the creatures that have ever existed that have gone extinct, right? And all that suffering. That's horrible. How could you believe in a God that allows for all that suffering? Because what's most important to Harris was what was most important to the Buddha: the ending of suffering. Harris says his moral landscape is based on reducing the suffering of conscious creatures. But there again, what is suffering really? Right? All suffering? Is there no good suffering? Think again of the things that we read in the Gorgias, right? Pain and evil can't be the same thing. So is suffering related to pain? How is it related to pain? Is suffering related to desires? I mean, Buddhism says that you get rid of suffering by getting rid of wrong desires, by having right desires. Well, wait a second. What is wrong and what is right? If you're going to say I need to reduce suffering, what is real suffering? What's your basis for saying that something is suffering? Being a little bit hungry. Buddhists fast a lot. Is fasting suffering? Should you not? But fasting is part of the process of achieving enlightenment for many Buddhists. So what type of suffering? How do you judge a suffering good or bad? It says that suffering is bad, and you should seek to understand suffering and seek to know how to how to escape suffering, how to remove suffering. So for Sam Harris, the suffering of conscious creatures is the bad thing, and you should reduce that. But how do you do that and maintain order and balance in the universe, right? So there are a lot of questions for Harris, right? When in his talk, in his book, really, his talk is a pretty good summation of the book. In reading the book, I didn't find much more in-depth answers for these questions, right? Can science provide the basis of well-being? What do you mean by well-being? Because he talks about well-being a lot, right? The end of suffering. What type of suffering? If I exercise, I hurt. If I build something that I haven't built before, I hurt, but it may be a good thing to do, right? Some exercise is good. Maybe too much exercise is bad, but what's too much? Well, the amount of exercise that's bad. What makes it bad? Well, it's too much and it hurts. Well, but the good exercise hurts too, right? What kind of pain? What's injury, right? What's the difference between injury and pain? What does social interaction have to do with well-being? If humans don't have a spirit, then well-being doesn't involve spiritual reality. But if humans do have a spirit, well-being might involve spiritual reality. And spiritual reality might transcend physical reality. So it may be worth a little bit of physical suffering to achieve certain spiritual well-being. But if there is no spirit, then it's not worth physical suffering, right? How do you define it, and on what basis? How can you prove, right? There's these assumptions. Furthermore, what is science, right? When we say science, what do we mean? Literally, the word science means knowledge. But do you mean the scientific method? What about the moral landscape follows the scientific method? You have so many assumptions. What would be what would be your what would you test against? What would how do you test a moral theory other than acting in that way? And what would be, how would you prove the outcome? I acted this way and had a better outcome. What do you mean by better outcome? I didn't die and you did? Well, what if a bad person killed me, right? They didn't die and I did. Were they better than me? It's how do you test these theories scientifically, according to the scientific method? What is well-being, right? I was getting that. Can science, when we ask, can science provide the basis of well-being? We're asking what science is, what well-being is. He talks about the suffering of conscious creatures. What is consciousness? For him, it's purely the brain. The brain doing what? What kind of consciousness? Self-consciousness? So if someone's not self-conscious, is it fair game to kill them? Do they not matter anymore? These are real questions, and there's a lot of assumptions behind what he says that he doesn't delve into and explain. His biggest assumption is this, that consciousness is a material reality. You have this gray matter in your head, and something is going on electrically and chemically that makes you self-conscious. Really? What is that? What is it? How do you measure it? How do you understand it? What does it look like? How do you know that? How do you know there's not conscious? How would you prove? Right? There are people that have done research on near-death experiences who are pretty convinced that there is something to consciousness that goes beyond the electrical and chemical functions of the gray matter in the brain, right? But how would they prove that to you? How could anyone know that with certainty? He's assuming that there's no spiritual reality. Again, how would you prove that absolute negative? You really can't. It's an assumption, right? So this is a real challenge for his moral structure and for a grounding for it, right? What is well-being? If you think about evolution, right? Now, Harris said that evolution can't do it. He said if evolution was the basis for morality, then the most fulfilling action would be for a man to donate to a sperm bank. It's a bit of a jest or a joke, but what other basis could he offer us on a purely material, biological basis for consciousness other than survival? I mean, he seems to care about survival because he talks about how science is going to help us start living to be 800 years old. But yeah, so what? You still die in 800 years. And is that a good thing? Right? He's kind of, 10 years ago, Elon Musk was kind of the he's everybody's sweetheart, but now he's not real popular and okay, whatever. But, Musk's idea is that, I mean, you don't want people to live that long. They get stale in their thinking, they're burdened on society. When, you know, Harris is holding up this idea that we could live to be 100 years old is this wonderful thing. But if somebody believes that their spirit's going to live forever because of, God, the transcendent, whatever, he thinks that's a bad thing. Why is it not a dangerous thing to put my hope in science to produce 800 years of life for me, to give me what might feel more like, what if I'm miserable? So what is the 800 years of life worth? It's just so much that he assumes and yet doesn't offer basis for, right? If you look at troops of primates, right? Very interesting. Is that what we are? Are we just more advanced primates? Can that give us insight into our own morality? Cain thought so. Does Harris think so? I don't know, but if you take that as part of the reality of this is physical reality, this is how primates work together. This is, there's bargaining, there's reciprocity. Well, it has problems, right? One troop of primates might be very altruistic within the troop and be willing to destroy another troop for the sake of survival. Right? Survival, is that the basis? Um, is that your grounding for morality? We have this whole problem. Are we subjective egoist? Are we collective utilitarian versus tradition? How do we balance between those two? Um, what in the moral landscape can answer that question, right? I mentioned the student who said it's wrong to kill a whole group of people for no reason, right? Well, there's a problem there. Um, it can't be merely majority rule, but nor can the desires of one person ride roughshod over the whole group. What basis, what grounding do you when you say the suffering of conscious creatures is the problem? Well, what if the lack of suffering in 1,000 conscious creatures depends upon suffering in one? Maybe that's not enough. What if it's 1,000,000? How do you right? It's the same problems that we saw with utilitarianism. Um, sorry, we've talked to this before, right? The moral hero. Where does that come from? Who decides? Franz Jagerstatter was an Austrian farmer who refused to sign a loyalty oath to Hitler and was killed for it. Is he a hero or is he just stupid? Who decides? Right? Looking back, it was easy to say, well, that's heroic. Yeah, well, during that time when his wife and daughters were being persecuted by the community and left without much provision and struggling to survive, right? I mean, why is that heroic? I mean, I think it is. The movie um, Hidden Life, excellent movie by Terrence Malick, excellent movie. It's about Franz Jagerstatter. Um, but who decides that that's the hero? And someone else who's annoying to the culture isn't a hero, is a sociopath, right? On what basis? It's not based on numbers, but it's also not based on mere individual courage, right? Jeffrey Dahmer had, in some sense, raw courage. We don't think he's a good guy or a moral hero, right? So, thinking of Sam Harris, right? What does he say? Um, well, for whether he's consistent theoretically with his Buddhism and the idea of kill the Buddha and the structure of the suffering of conscious creatures, how do you decide what's right and wrong? Is it survival of the fittest? Is it the most good for the most people? Um, back in the 2020 election, there was this big debate over Hunter Biden's laptop and the crimes he committed. And it came out after the election that if that laptop story had been allowed to run as true as it was proven to be, that it could have led to the election of Trump in 2020 instead of um, Biden. And it's no certain. It was just a poll conducted after the election, what people necessarily would have done. But the poll was if you had known that the content of Hunter Biden's laptop was real and that there was a cover up and that there were crimes done and that it may reflect upon Joe Biden, would you have changed your vote? And a lot of people said, yeah. Sam Harris said, I don't care. And what he literally said was Hunter Biden literally could have had the corpses of dead children in his basement. I would not have cared. Why? Well, he saw the election of Donald Trump as the worst thing that could happen. And so he didn't care about any other evils, right? Well, is that the way is that moral consistency? Does that fit your moral landscape, right? Um, I think this man might be a Nazi, so I'm gonna. What I don't like Hitler, so I'm gonna vote for Stalin. I mean, people make those kind of decisions. I'm not saying that Trump was Hitler and Biden was Stalin, but my point is, this kind of thinking can lead you there. And do you necessarily have to go there? Is that moral thinking? Um, is that consistent moral thinking? Is that a significant and useful grounding? Right? How consistent is Harris with his own grounding? That's the question we need to ask. The grounding of morality, right? I would argue it's hard to ground morality apart from something transcendent. That doesn't mean that every transcendent system is equally good. It doesn't mean that transcendent systems dealing with humans, and by transcendent I mean based upon some idea of existence and God and goodness beyond the physical realm of human beings. There's something more beyond our mere physical experience. An understanding of something beyond this temporal life, I would say, is arguably necessary for objective morals. Um, that's the moral argument for God on some level. It creates a problem for the argument from evil against God, because where do you get your standard of evil, right? Which is part of why Sam Harris is doing what he does with the moral landscape. Um, there is a question of how your grounding is has to be based on what is true and what is real, and sometimes it's hard for us to know that. So as you move ahead, keep those things in mind. As you move into the argument against God from evil, if you move into the argument for the existence of God from morality, um, most of what you're going to get is from the assignments. I will record like one or two more short lectures to kind of help with your thinking for your final projects, depending on what which question you choose to answer.